Hi, y'all. Okay, review for the test. I emailed you guys this review for final exam. So anything on your old test is fair game, but it'll mostly be new information that you guys need to know. Okay, homework from the past few weeks, stuff we've gone over in class. All right. So the very first thing listed on here after the amendments is to know the three branches of government. I sure hope you guys know those by now. The legislative, the executive, and the judicial. And remember, legislative is anything to do with Congress, the Senate or the House. So Nancy Pelosi, John Boehner, any of those guys, okay? The executive branch has to do with the president and anything in the cabinet, like the Attorney General, Eric Holder, or Secretary of State, who used to be Hillary Clinton. You can do the current Secretary of State also if you'd rather, but I just wanted you to know her, and she was in the beginning of government class, so that's who we're sticking with. And then judicial is anything to do with the Supreme Court or courts. That's the judicial branch, okay? And also know the job of these branches. The legislative job is to make the laws. Do you know it is not the judicial's job to make laws? It's not the executive branch's job to make laws. It is supposed to be the executive branch's job to submit a budget and that kind of thing, which President Obama hasn't done. So I think currently now they're talking about a budget, but it's their job, and they've never really submitted a budget. So it's not the legislative's job to do that. But anyway, the legislative's job is supposed to make laws. And the executive's job is to carry out the laws, to make sure that they're enforced. The judicial branch is supposed to judge like the rulings through the courts to make sure it's constitutional. Now they kind of judge the laws, but that really wasn't the intent of the judicial branch. And remember, so many times throughout history, presidents, we talked about that. Abraham Lincoln, James Madison, they routinely ignored the rulings of the Supreme Court. And when Abraham Lincoln declared that all the slaves were free, and then the Congress passed the 13th Amendment, both went against the acting ruling, which was Dred Scott, that slaves were property. So they traditionally ignored the rulings of the court. It's only in recent times that the court rulings with Roe v. Wade, where they decided abortion was legal for everybody, but it didn't go through Congress. Laws are supposed to go through Congress. So with all these Supreme Court rulings, and we go by it, but really, Congress hasn't passed the law. So many of our controversial issues today, which are supposed to go through Congress. If you want gay marriage to be legal, let it go through Congress. Let abortion go through Congress. They know they don't have the support. And so they pass things through activist judges on the judiciary, and that's how we've gotten so many of our, really they're not laws, they're just current rulings that we've gone by, is because of activist judges, where it just shouldn't be the case. It should be started in Congress. All right, so here's your sheet. The first thing listed is the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And 13th Amendment, of course, is freeing the slaves. Right after the war, we passed the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was passed because the Democrats, especially in the South, they say, okay, well, you can free the slaves all you want, but we're not making them citizens of our state. And so we passed the 14th Amendment saying, oh, yes, they are citizens of your state. So 13th Amendment freed the slaves. 14th Amendment gave the freed slaves citizenship in whatever state they resided in. 15th Amendment gave black Americans the right to vote. Of course, it was black men, so the right to vote, okay? Know the three branches of government. I hope you know that by now. What's the role of the president and the cabinet? And their role is to enforce the laws. The legislative's job is to make the laws. Executive job, enforce the laws. And then I list a bunch of people, and I want you to tell me what branch of government they're in. We've talked about them so many times. I just want you to start thinking about what branches they're in. Okay, so if I say Nancy Pelosi, legislative, good. John Boehner, legislative. So he's Speaker of the House. Nancy Pelosi, Minority Leader. John Roberts, good. Judicial branch. He's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Clarence Thomas, judicial, good. He's another conservative justice on the Supreme Court. Harry Reid, Majority Leader in the Senate. He's a Democrat, and they're in charge in the Senate, and that's the legislative branch. They make the laws. Barack Obama, good. Executive branch, he's the president. Antonin Scalia, He's in the judicial branch, and he's a U.S. Supreme Court Justice. Hillary Clinton, former Secretary of State, executive branch. Eric Holder, executive branch, good. Attorney General. All right, what is Roe v. Wade? We just talked about that. Made abortion legal in all 50 states. And it's still the ruling now that stands. That's why Democrats are really afraid of Republicans naming a Supreme Court justice, because they're afraid if we get one more conservative justice, Kennedy's usually the swing vote, if we get one more conservative, that will overturn Roe v. Wade. So they're very afraid of that, and they'll remember the whole Borking thing came up where Reagan introduced Robert Bork, and they didn't, they were afraid of how his rulings would be, so now they call it the Borking of people, because they don't want him to be put on the court, and so they'll just revolt against him really for pure political reasons. You have to know about Dred Scott and why it was important. I did a video on Dred Scott you can go watch too, but really it's just important because it said that people, remember black Americans had held, then they weren't Americans necessarily, but freed slaves or people that weren't slaves had held office, they had had important jobs, and all of a sudden the Dred Scott ruling came along and said, hey, these blacks are just property. And so people then could go up north and just captured free black people and just bring them into slavery, and they can go recapture slaves that had run away, and all of a sudden it just stirred up everything in society. So Dred Scott was just an important ruling that actually still stands, and Abraham Lincoln just ignored it when he freed the slaves. Know about vetoes and how to override. The vetoes, of course, 2/3 majority. You can override a veto. How many civil rights laws were passed in the 1800s for black Americans? Then remember, we passed 23 civil rights laws. All these civil rights laws were passed, and then as soon as the Democrats got control of Congress again, much later, they rescinded all these laws, and it was 75 years again before blacks had the right to vote and got their freedom. But we had passed all these civil rights laws, and there were black men serving in Congress and as judges and everything, and then they all got rescinded. Most people do not know that. I did not know that all these civil rights laws had been passed, and then all of them were rescinded, and then we had to wait 75 years to get the same civil rights back. Let's see. No information sheet on John Quincy Adams. I'm going to probably ask you specific questions that I went over. And the two other men I gave you sheets on, Daniel Webster and the man who wrote Ben-Hur. Just want you to know that information. Know about the paintings and the symbolism in our buildings representing our Christian heritage. I'm specifically going to ask you about they're in the Congressional House of Prayer, even now, they're in the prayer chapel, the prayer chapel off the rotunda in the Capitol building, and they're kneeling at the prayer bench. What are they looking at? And I'm looking for, of course, that they're looking at George Washington kneeling. He's taking a knee and he's praying. And the scripture that's over his head, I'm specifically asking for that. Who did he mentor during his time in the House of Representatives after he was president? Of course, that is Abraham Lincoln, which I think is so great. And remember, what did they call John Quincy Adams? They called him the hellhound of abolition. And really, what is Abraham Lincoln known for? So I think that's so great. What was the nickname for Daniel Webster? And what tradition did he start that is still continued today in the Senate? Remember, he was a great orator, and people would pull back if they knew that he was fighting against them, because they knew, oh, well, he's just so great. He would read the Bible, remember, and people would gather around. But the tradition he started, do you remember it had to do with the desk and how he scratched his name in the bottom of the desk in the Senate, and they still use that today. And the representative that uses his desk, they add their names in the back of the desk. All right, we'll have part 2. It should only be a couple minutes. Okay.